Hi, I'm Dr. Andrew Snelling. I've been through the Grand Canyon over 50 times on raft trips, hiked in the Grand.
Years ago, we took our family on a vacation. We went on a raft trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon.
So I have a quick question. Why did God make the Grand Canyon?
Jesus warned about this moment. Ancient prophets described it in detail. And right now, deep inside one of the most visited places on Earth, the evidence is finally surfacing. Most people walk past it every single day without realizing what it means. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Grand Canyon stretches 277 miles across the heart of Arizona. It plunges over a mile deep into the earth. Millions of people visit every single year. They take photos, they stare out at the view, they leave. In 1909, something happened in the Grand Canyon that should have made global headlines. Two explorers were moving along the canyon walls when they noticed something unusual. An opening in the rock, hidden high above the Colorado River, difficult to reach, almost impossible to spot unless you were looking for it. They went inside. What they found stopped them cold. Dark passages stretched deep into the canyon, room after room carved with a level of precision that made no sense for the time period. Walls covered in symbols, tools and weapons unlike anything belonging to local tribes, and artifacts unmistakably linked to a civilization thousands of miles away, ancient Egypt. Now, before moving past that, think about what that means. The Grand Canyon sits in the middle of Arizona. Egypt sits on the other side of the world. And yet, what was found inside those underground chambers matched Egyptian craftsmanship so closely that researchers were left without an explanation. There was more. Deep inside those passages, more than 1,000 feet underground, they found mummies, large ones, preserved in the dry underground air, dressed in dark linen, covered in traces of precious metals. The findings were documented. The artifacts were packed up and sent to one of the most powerful institutions in America. And then, silence. The institution denied the expedition ever happened. Records disappeared. The explorers faded from official history. And the area where the entrance was found became one of the most restricted zones in the entire national park. Ask yourself why. What kind of discovery gets buried that completely?
Dead life forms that have been buried in these layers of sediment that the Grand Canyon exposes.
Because whatever was inside those walls was not meant to be found, and it was not meant to be connected to what the prophets wrote. But the underground city was not the only thing hiding inside the Grand Canyon. In 2016, a geologist was hiking along one of the canyon's most popular trails when a large piece of rock broke away from the cliff face above him. It crashed to the ground and split open. What was inside stopped him mid-step. Footprints, fossilized deep into the stone, clear enough to photograph, detailed enough to study, and old enough to completely challenge what scientists thought they knew about life in this region. These tracks were estimated to be over 313 million years old. That makes them the oldest vertebrate tracks ever discovered in the Grand Canyon. The creature that left them was small, roughly a foot long, moving diagonally across ancient sand with deliberate purpose. But here's what nobody talks about. That rock had been sitting on that trail for years. Hundreds of thousands of hikers had walked right past it. Nobody noticed, nobody looked, until one man looked down at exactly the right moment. Some call that luck. Others call it something else entirely. Because the deeper researchers dig into the Grand Canyon, literally and figuratively, the more they find things that were not supposed to surface. Things that challenge the official timeline. Things that raise questions nobody in an official position seems eager to answer. And the fossilized tracks were just the beginning. Inside caves embedded in the canyon cliffs, scientists found something else, something preserved so perfectly it looked almost recent. but what was inside of those caves had been sitting there for tens of thousands of years, untouched, undisturbed, waiting. And what it revealed about this place will completely change the way the rest of this story lands. Most people have no idea that the Grand Canyon has caves. Not small cracks in the rock. Actual caves. Some so narrow a person has to crawl to get through. Others large enough to stand upright in without touching the walls. Hidden inside the canyon cliffs, invisible from the main viewpoints, completely off limits to the public. And what was found inside them is unlike anything discovered in this region before. Researchers who gained access to these caves found remains, plants, animals, preserved in extraordinary condition by the dry underground air. Some of these remains dated back over 40,000 years, right to the heart of the last ice age. But one discovery stood above the rust. In a cave at the far western end of the canyon, scientists found piles of ancient dung, enormous piles, the size of bowling balls, stacked across the cave floor as if they had been left there recently. They had not been left there recently. Carbon dating revealed they belonged to a creature that had been extinct for over 10,000 years, a giant ground sloth, nearly 9 feet long, over 500 pounds, a creature that once roamed this canyon in numbers large enough to leave behind evidence that survived for millennia. And inside that dung, preserved plant material, seeds, fibers, evidence of a landscape that no longer exists above ground. But that was not the most unsettling find in those caves. Researchers also found mummified condors, so perfectly preserved that skin and fine tissue details were still visible on certain bones. And when chemical analysis was performed on those remains, the results pointed to something much larger, a chain of extinction. One creature dying led to another disappearing, and another, and another. A pattern that feels very familiar when placed next to a certain ancient text. Now, pull back from the caves for a moment, because while all of this was being discovered beneath the surface, something was happening above it that nobody could ignore. The Colorado River is dying. This is not a theory. This is not speculation. Scientists, environmentalists, and government agencies have all confirmed it. The river that carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, the same river that has flowed continuously through this landscape since before recorded history, is running out of water, and it is happening fast. The river stretches over 1,400 miles from the Rocky Mountains down through the American Southwest. It passes through the Grand Canyon. It feeds reservoirs that supply water to millions of people across California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. But those reservoirs are dropping. The lines on the canyon walls around Lake Mead tell the story clearly. Stark white bands of exposed rock stretching high above the current water level, each one representing years of loss that cannot simply be reversed. Dams built decades ago were supposed to control the flow. Instead, they created a system so dependent on consistent water levels that when those levels began to drop, the entire structure started to crack. And the water keeps dropping. Scientists warn that if the trend continues, entire communities will lose access to their water supply. Agriculture across the Southwest will collapse, and one of the most powerful natural forces on Earth will be reduced to a trickle running through a canyon it once shaped with enormous force. But here's what makes this more than just an environmental story. This river appears in ancient prophecy. Not a river like it, not a river nearby. This exact river, by description, by location, by behavior. And what that prophecy says happens next is something very few people are prepared to hear. There is a pattern forming here. An underground city connected to a civilization that should never have reached this place. Fossilized evidence that keeps surfacing against all expectations. caves preserving records of extinction that mirror modern events, and a river that has sustained life for millions of years now visibly retreating. None of this feels random, and when these discoveries are placed alongside what ancient texts actually say, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. The book of Revelation describes a time when the natural world begins to break down, when water sources fail, when things hidden beneath the earth begin to surface, when signs appear in places people pass every single day without understanding what they are seeing. It describes these things not as distinct possibilities, but as certainties, and it describes them in a specific order. First, the earth reveals what it has been holding. Then, the water sources weaken. Then, what was sealed beneath the ground becomes exposed. And then, the warnings that were ignored for generations become impossible to ignore any longer. Now look at the Grand Canyon, an underground world discovered and then buried in silence. Ancient remains surfacing through cracking rock, a river visibly weakening year by year, and restricted zones expanding quietly while official explanations grow thinner. The sequence is not identical to every word written in those ancient texts, but it is close enough to stop a person cold. Because the prophets who wrote these words were not writing about a place they had visited. They were not describing something they had seen with their own eyes. They were recording what they believed was shown to them about a time that had not yet come, a time that was coming. And several of the signs they described are no longer coming. They are already here. But there is one more discovery inside the Grand Canyon that does not fit into any category. Not archaeological, not geological, not easily explained by science or history. It was spotted using satellite imaging, a formation in the canyon walls approximately 250 miles from Las Vegas, visible from above, invisible from the ground, and shaped in a way that stopped researchers the moment they saw it. It looks like a doorway, not a crack in the rock, not a natural erosion pattern, a deliberate rectangular opening carved into the canyon wall with proportions that do not occur naturally in this type of terrain. The moment images of this formation spread online, the debate exploded. Some researchers pointed to the precision of the angles. Natural rock formations erode in irregular patterns. Wind and water carve curves and jagged edges. They do not carve clean rectangular openings with consistent proportions on multiple sides. Others pointed to the location. This formation sits in one of the most remote and restricted sections of the entire canyon, an area that has never been fully opened to public access, an area where independent researchers cannot simply walk in and take measurements. And then there's what the formation appears to align with. Because when the position of this structure is mapped against known archaeological sites in the surrounding region, a pattern emerges, a directional alignment that connects this doorway to other ancient sites in a straight line that stretches far beyond the canyon itself. Ancient cultures built with intention. They aligned their structures to the stars, to the sun, to each other. This formation follows that same logic. But nobody built the Grand Canyon. So what carved a doorway into its walls with that level of precision? And more importantly, what was it built to mark? Because some researchers believe it was not built to keep something out. It was built to mark something sealed inside. Every culture that has ever lived near the Grand Canyon has said the same thing. Not in the same language, not in the same tradition, but with the same core belief running through every story, every ritual, every warning passed down through generations. Something is inside this place. The Hopi people who have lived in this region for centuries describe the canyon as a gateway, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a literal threshold between the physical world and something beyond it. A place where the boundary between what is seen and what is unseen becomes thin enough to cross. They have always treated it with extraordinary reverence and extraordinary caution, because their traditions do not describe this gateway as peaceful. They describe it as guarded, watched over by forces that do not welcome intrusion, forces that respond when the boundary is disturbed. Now, place that alongside what the book of Revelation describes. There is a passage, specific, detailed, and deeply unsettling, that describes 4 entities bound beneath the earth, held in place, sealed away, prevented from acting until a precise moment in time arrives. That moment is described as being tied to specific global conditions: water sources weakening, hidden things surfacing, natural systems breaking down in sequence, and a world so distracted by its own noise that it fails to notice the signs appearing in plain sight. The passage does not name a location, but it describes a great river, and it describes what happens when that river can no longer contain what is held beneath it. Researchers who have studied both the Hopi traditions and the biblical text have noted the overlap. Not identical, but close enough to raise a question that is very difficult to shake. What if the canyon is not just a geological formation? What if it was always meant to be something else entirely? And what if the discoveries being made right now, the artifacts, the caves, the sealed doorway, the dying river, the ancient traditions, all of it leads back to the same place? A warning that was given a very long time ago. Jesus did not speak in vague terms when he described the events that would signal the end of this age. He was specific. He described a world where hidden things would be revealed, where natural systems would begin to fail in visible and undeniable ways, where signs would appear that most people would see but not understand. He warns that the days leading up to his return would feel ordinary to most people. Life would continue. People would go about their routines. They would visit places like the Grand Canyon, take their photographs, and leave without asking a single question about what was beneath their feet. And the signs would keep appearing in the rocks, in the water, and the things surfacing from beneath the ground that were never supposed to surface. He warned that these moments would come suddenly, that the window between seeing the signs and being prepared for what followed would be shorter than most people expected. And he warned something else, that the generation that saw these things begin to happen would not pass before everything he described reached its conclusion. Look at what is happening in the Grand Canyon right now. The river dropping, the caves opening, the restricted zones expanding, the artifacts that should not exist surfacing through cracking rock. This is not a coincidence. This is not a geological quirk. This is the warning made visible. And the question that remains, the one that matters more than any artifact or any satellite image or any ancient text, is a simple one. Here is what researchers are not saying publicly. The restrictions around the Grand Canyon are not getting smaller. They are getting larger, quietly, without announcement. Areas that were accessible 5 years ago are now closed. New barriers have appeared in sections of the canyon that have no obvious geological reason to be sealed off. Park rangers receive letters every single week from visitors who took something from the canyon and came back to return it. Rocks, sand, twigs, small things that should mean nothing. But the letters tell the same story over and over again. Something changed the moment they left with it. Unexplained events, sudden misfortune, a feeling that something was deeply wrong that did not lift until the item was returned. Dismiss that if it feels comfortable to do so, but add it to everything else that has been covered here. The underground chambers, the artifacts that crossed an ocean they should never have crossed, the fossilized tracks appearing through splitting rock, the mummified remains of creatures preserved for 40,000 years, the dying river, the doorway carved into an unreachable wall, the traditions of people who have watched this place for centuries and never stopped warning others to treat it with caution. Add it all together, and then consider this. The ancient texts that describe what happens when the sealed things beneath the earth are finally released do not describe it as a slow process. They describe it as sudden, a moment that comes without the kind of warning most people expect. not a gradual shift, not a news headline with time to prepare. A moment that arrives while the world is looking somewhere else entirely. The Grand Canyon has been holding something for a very long time. The river that was supposed to keep it contained is retreating. The rock walls are cracking open. And somewhere deep inside those restricted zones, in passages that have not seen light in thousands of years, something is still there.